Hello, my name is Taylor, and this is my presentation on examining the triple code model in numerical cognition, an fMRI study written by Skagenholt et al. 2018. To give a quick overview, the triple code model was introduced by Dehane in 1992. It discusses that there are three components involved in number processing: the visual Arabic number form, the auditory verbal word frame, and the analog non-symbolic magnitude representations. Arabic digits are represented by numbers, verbal words are number words, so essentially the number spelled out, and non-symbolic magnitudes are represented with dots. As you can see, I have an image just highlighting this model. Although we learn about fMRIs in nearly every psychology course, I thought I would give a quick overview. Functional magnetic resonance imaging measures brain activity through monitoring the changes in blood flow throughout the brain. Individuals administering the testing will have the participants complete some sort of task in order to watch the blood move to the functioning areas. As you can see, I have an image here highlighting a few examples. In the speech example, you can see multiple activations through the yellow coloring throughout the brain. And on the finger tap example, there's only one little tiny yellow activation on the right side. Now moving on to prior research in the triple code model and fMRI. Previous studies have only primarily focused on either one or two of the components at once. No study using fMRI testing with the triple code model have yet studied all three components. Previous literature suggests that the visual number form area is responsible for the processing of Arabic numerals. However, although there are many suggestions, the specific location has not yet been determined. Additionally, prior literature suggests that the left hemispheric language areas such as the inferior frontal gyrus, supramarginal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, and the superior temporal gyrus are responsible for the auditory verbal word frame. Furthermore, prior literature has suggested that the intraparietal sulcus is responsible for the processing of non-symbolic magnitude. It has been suggested that an overlap exists between the numerical and magnitudinal processing. Now moving on to the study at hand, Skagenholt et al. 2018. It was the first study to assess all three components of the triple code model at once in adults using fMRI studies. The predictions of the study included functionally and spatially dissociated neuronal locations will be responsible for all three codes of the TCM, increased blood oxygen level in the visual number form area in the right inferior temporal gyrus in visual Arabic digit tasks, increased blood oxygen level in the bilateral horizontal segment of the intraparietal sulcus during numerical verbal processing, as well as activation of the intraparietal sulcus across all tasks. Now moving on to the methods. Participants consisted of a rather large group coming in at 54 right-handed healthy adult university students with normal or corrected vision, as well as no evidence or history of drug abuse or neurological illness. There were 3 experimental tasks, 1 control task, and 2 unrelated tasks. The 3 experimental tasks were broken into Arabic digital comparison, verbal number comparison, and non-symbolic magnitude comparison. Experimental and control procedures were administered over 6 experimental blocks and repeated for a total of 6 cycles. Distant and close number pairs were alternated in every other cycle of blocks, and a 12-second resting period was administered at the end of each block. There were 14 trials per block, each of which was presented for a total of 4,000 milliseconds. In the Arabic digit comparison task, a pair of single Arabic digits were presented horizontally, and participants were instructed to select the digit of larger numerical value. This is an example of the stimuli that may have been presented. As you can see, the 3 versus 4 is an example of the close effect, and the 3 versus 9 is an example of the distance effect. Similarly to the Arabic digits, in the verbal number comparison task, a pair of single verbal numerical digits were presented horizontally, and participants were instructed to select the number word of larger numerical value. This is an example of the stimuli that may have been presented. Once again, you can see that the 3 versus 4 is an example of the close effect, and the 3 versus 9 is an example of the distance effect. In the non-symbolic magnitude comparison task, 2 groups of randomly scattered dots were presented to participants, and they were required to select the group with the greater amount of dots. In the study, they used blue and yellow dots. However, here I have shown an example of purple dots. And finally, the control task. Participants were presented with lowercase and uppercase letters and instructed to select the uppercase letter to act as a baseline test. Here are some examples of this below. To sum everything up, here's an illustration of how each block was completed. They were prompted with an instruction phase at the beginning, followed by the test in which they answered through pressing the left or right prompts on the screen, then a screen that provided no feedback. They were then given a 12-second rest before being prompted by the next task. As you can see, the participants were presented with the Arabic digits first, followed by verbal, non-symbolic, and then the control group. The distance and close effects were alternated between blocks. The results of this task are interesting because they show the opposite results of previous behavioral task methods. Most found that distant trials generally have shorter reaction times due to the fact that it is easier to differentiate between numbers with a greater distance between them. Professor Chan Reynolds and I were discussing the example of what is further from Peterborough, Omimi or Havelock. The answer is Havelock, but the reaction time would be longer in comparison to asking, for example, what is further from Peterborough, Omimi or Toronto. The close effect takes a little more time to think about in comparison to this distance effect. As you can see here in the Arabic task, the distance trials have a greater reaction time than in the close trials. The verbal task shows similar effects, with the close task having the quickest reaction time. The non-symbolic task, however, showed the normal results as the distant trials showed the shortest reaction time. This is an interesting finding, as the Arabic and verbal tasks did not show the standardized distance effect like the non-symbolic trial. The active brain areas while completing the Arabic digital comparison task were found in the occipital and temporal lobes, insula, anterior cingulate cortex, superior frontal gyrus, amygdala, and right angular gyrus. Although Professor Chan Reynolds may not be able to see, the blood oxygen levels are shown in the image in red. As you can see by the red coloring, the areas are fairly close together. After the completion of a region of interest analysis, significant activity in the inferior temporal gyrus was found, nearly reaching the middle temporal gyrus. This supported predictions. Due to this activation, it is possible that this area could represent a location of the visual number form area. Early activity in the early dorsal stream visual areas V1, V2, and V3 suggests that numerical processing also happens in the visual stream. I realize that listing all of these brain regions may seem overwhelming, so I thought I would give an overview of the areas of significance. On the left-hand side, I have a brain image showing the inferior temporal gyrus circled in yellow. As you can see, the middle temporal gyrus is right above it. On the right-hand side, I realize this image is busier than the previous, but you can see the dorsal stream, that is, it essentially moves up the brain in comparison to the ventral stream that flows down. The areas of activation in the Arabic task were the V1, V2, and V3, and you will see the black arrow pointing in their direction. The brain activations while completing the verbal number comparison task were found in the occipital and temporal lobes, precuneus, superior and inferior temporal gyri, anterior cingulate cortex, insula, thalamus, hippocampus, superior frontal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, and right angular gyrus. After the completion of a region of interest analysis, significant activity was found in the inferior frontal gyrus, which is also known as Broca's area. Here's an image denoting the activation of the inferior frontal gyrus in the verbal tasks. The inferior frontal gyrus is also known as Broca's area, so here's an image that points out the location of this in blue and labeled. The brain activations while completing the non-symbolic magnitude comparison tasks were found in occipital and frontal lobes, anterior cingulate cortex, middle cingulate cortex, inferior and superior frontal gyri. You can see these activations in the image to the right, and as you can see, the activations seem to be more localized in comparison to the other scans. After the completion of a region of interest analysis, there were no significant activations found in the intraparietal sulcus, which goes against the prediction that all three tasks would show activation of the IPS. Here's an image to give a location of the intraparietal sulcus. It is the line highlighted in red, however, I have added an arrow as well to make this more clear. To conclude, there were varying results in the behavioral tasks as previously mentioned. The response times were longer for those of distance compared to close for all but the non-symbolic magnitude test. This is something that should be taken into consideration for future studies. Furthermore, the activation in the early visual areas V1, V2, and V3 in Arabic digit processing suggests that this area is not only responsible for magnitudinal processing, but also numerical processing, suggesting a newly discovered overlap. The activation of the anterior and medial cingulate cortex in numerical processing was a new finding, as this is only previously reported activity in magnitudinal processing. The inclusion of the limbic system, so the thalamus, hippocampus, and basal ganglia, in verbal number comparison tasks, supports previous literature that has assessed this. The study was not able to pinpoint the direct area of the visual number form area. However, they were able to further identify a cluster of areas that may be involved. In regards to the predictions, activations of the intraparietal sulcus was not seen across all tasks. However, there was an activation of the intraparietal sulcus during numerical verbal processing. As well, there was increased blood oxygen level in the right inferior temporal gyrus in visual Arabic digit tasks. Thank you for watching my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it.